Okay, so here's what we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about kind of the core principles of trauma-informed care, how to apply them to work with substance use clients. We're going to talk a little bit about the brain, how trauma and substance use or addiction impacts the brain. Talk a little bit about prevalence of trauma and talk more about strategies on how to help clients who have these kind of co-occurring pieces of substance use or addiction and trauma. So it's a lot to get done in a short period of time. So we'll see how we do. So we're going to start. Oops. Let me see my slides here. Okay, good. Okay, so kind of the most prevailing idea around addiction these days is that it's a disease. And so the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, offered this definition that addiction is defined as a chronic relapsing brain disease that's characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. And it's considered a brain disease because the drugs that are used change the brain and change the structure and how it works. And also even process addictions, they've done some brain scans and research, and it stimulates the same parts of the brain that substances stimulate in terms of the reward pathway. So even though it doesn't say it in this definition, that process addictions or behavioral addictions would also follow the disease model. I think you can include that there as well, because it does function and alter the brain. So let's talk about the brain a little bit. So here's a very blown up version of your neurons in your brain. So in your brain, these neurons communicate with each other. So one neuron up here at the top communicates with the next neuron here below. And we have a couple of components that are important to look at, that we have receptor sites. So we have a transporter right here with these little kind of parallel blocks. And then we have the synapse, which is the space in between the neurons. And then we have these receptors that kind of pick up whatever is put out into the synapse. So in this case, we're looking at cocaine and how cocaine functions in the brain. Each drug functions just a little bit different, but they all function within this system. So the concepts are applicable to no matter what drug we're talking about, but we're specifically going to look at cocaine just as a reference point. So up here in this neuron, we have these vesicles, and they contain the neurotransmitter dopamine. And you've probably heard about dopamine many times, but it's basically our naturally occurring happy drug in the brain. So in the brain, we have several neurotransmitters. Some of them are like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, GABA. There's several of them that have been identified. And so depending on which substance or chemical somebody is using, it's going to impact one of those neurotransmitters. So in this case, cocaine impacts dopamine. So we have these vesicles up here that hold all the dopamine, and there's a pathway right here, which is the transporter, that kind of opens up and lets the dopamine out or in. So it's the pathway for things to go in and out of this neuron up here. So what happens with cocaine, you can see over here with this black, that the dopamine transporter is blocked by cocaine. So what happens is all this dopamine floods out here in the synapse. And this other neuron might be the one that picks it up through the receptors. So this dopamine kind of pings all around here in the synapse, which is flooding our brain with happy drugs, basically. So that's how the euphoria happens. So when somebody's using cocaine and they feel high or euphoric, that's because of this flood of dopamine into the synapse. And then also it's collected by these receptor sites, and the neuron down here also receives a flood of dopamine through their receptor sites. So it's kind of dopamine is being pushed out and absorbed all over the place in the brain. And that's what creates the euphoria of somebody feeling high. So that's functionally what's happening in the brain, and how this is kind of how we've come to the conclusion that substance use or addiction is a brain disease, because it interacts with the functioning of our brain and causes this euphoria. And you can make the same case for process addictions or behavioral addictions, because they also trigger these symptoms, not in the same way that a chemical does. It's not necessarily sitting, cocaine sits on the dopamine transporter. It's not necessarily that, but it's still triggering the release of our naturally occurring happy drugs, like the dopamine or any of the other neurotransmitters. And so it's creating a euphoric effect, even though it's not necessarily a chemical. So it's still activating the same system. So that was your crash course in how substances affect the brain and what's going on functionally in the brain. So now let's add on the trauma piece. So you may or may not have heard of adverse childhood experiences, but it's been around for quite a while. Large body of research has come out over the kind of decades about adverse childhood experiences. And basically there's a little checklist that you can look at and take if you'd like. It's on the public domain, so you can just Google it and find it. But basically it's asking about a variety of things that you might have experienced as a child. And then that score that you receive kind of indicates a risk level for developing diagnoses like mood disorders, PTSD, but also addiction, how it might impact relationships. So there's been a lot of research around how your childhood experiences, and ones that maybe aren't so great, are a little bit more negative, how those impact you as you grow and then into adulthood. And do those have correlation with mental health and create, kind of developing a diagnosable mental health issue later on. So here's some of the things that the ACE, and they're kind of shorthand called ACEs. So your ACE score or the ACEs show up. So here's some of them: recurrent and severe physical abuse. So if you had that, you would check that box. And about 11% of the people that have taken the adverse childhood experiences have that. So this is generalizable information because they've done it so many times. So you can kind of extrapolate this to the general population, that there's, a good bit of people out there that are having recurrent and severe physical abuse as a child. Same thing for emotional abuse, about 11%. Contact sexual abuse, so this means they had some kind of a contact or encounter that would be considered sexual abuse, about 22%. Growing up with an alcoholic or drug user, about 24%. Growing up with a family member that's in prison, about 3%. Growing up with a family member with a mental illness, 19%. Growing up seeing your mother being treated violently, so that speaks to a little bit more of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, 12%. Growing up with both parents not being present, 22%. So as you can see kind of by these numbers, that there's a good percentage of the population that have had at least one of these things, or could have several of these things going on. And that might be considered trauma experiences. So how does this impact addiction? Why does it matter? So kind of what they found from the research, that women were 50% more likely than men to have experienced 5 or more adverse childhood experiences. So that's kind of a lot. 50% of women, that's a half. So 1 in 2 women will have 5 or more of those adverse childhood experiences that I just listed. and that the higher the ACE score, the higher the chances of addiction to alcohol or other drugs in adulthood. So 4 or more ACEs is a 500% increase in risk for adults to develop an alcohol use issue. Men with 6 or more ACEs are 4,600% more likely or increase in risk to be IV drug users. So that's huge. 78% of IV drug use in women can be attributed to adverse childhood experiences. So they've kind of gone backwards in the research where they've given ACE scores to people in substance use treatment programs or addiction treatment programs and compiled that data to see how many of those people also had these adverse childhood experiences and how many. And so 78% of IV drug use in women is attributed to adverse childhood experiences. So there's kind of a direct correlation there. So all this to say that if you've had some of these adverse childhood experiences, it puts you at an increased likelihood of developing maladaptive coping skills, i.e. substance use, addiction-related issues. So a lot of treatment facilities have started using the ACE questionnaire in their intake processes to kind of assess when clients are coming in to a substance use treatment, what kind of trauma might be there that we need to, from a co-occurring perspective, deal with in order to help them with their addiction-related issues. So this is the guy who came up with ACEs. His name is Vince Folletti. I actually got to hear him talk a couple of years ago. Fascinating research. If you ever get a chance to hear him talk, the ACEs was actually developed out of a obesity clinic back in, I don't know, maybe the 80s. I'm terrible with dates, so don't quote me on that. But basically they were running a clinic to help people lose weight that were kind of chronically obese and struggling with weight loss, and found out that a lot of times the people weren't losing weight or staying on the weight management program because they had underlying trauma that needed to be dealt with. And so that's where this tool, this questionnaire, was originally developed, that they found all of these kind of childhood experiences that seemed to impact these clients' ability to lose weight. So that was where it started, and then kind of blossomed from there and moved well beyond the original, weight loss clinic concept to being globally applicable. So what Dr. Folletti found, and kind of this quote here, is that maybe it's not about the drug dealers and dangerous chemicals, but maybe it's about the way that people are treated as children and the way that we treat each other, as he says in the first sentence here, that needs to be the focus. So maybe if we could work on dealing with some of these adverse childhood experiences in a more productive way, then it wouldn't lead to all these issues in adulthood. And so kind of his last sentence here suggests that billions of dollars have been spent everywhere except where the answer is to be found. So that maybe we're not spending our money society-wide on the right things, which I thought was an interesting look at the findings here, interesting perspective. It makes you think about things like the war on drugs and implications of that maybe aren't working because we haven't won that war, and we're not winning, we're in fact losing. So maybe we need to look at things a little bit differently, and maybe trauma is really something we need to focus more time on in treatment and deal with from a trauma-informed perspective as well as a co-occurring perspective. Okay, so let's talk about the trauma's effects on the brain. So here's 3 primary brain regions that are impacted by PTSD and trauma in general. So the prefrontal cortex, which is right here, this blue part. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for abstract thinking. This is where our personality develops, our behavioral regulation, planning, and problem solving. So think about that when you're exposed to maybe some of those adverse childhood experiences that we just spoke about, and that trauma, how it in fact impacts this prefrontal cortex. Wow, with abstract thinking, problem solving, behavior regulation, sounds kind of like addiction, doesn't it? That there may be some impulse control issues going on there, trouble making decisions that are healthy, speaking to that problem solving element. So that's one area of the brain. Amygdala is the next one, which is this little bitty red spot right there in the middle. Again, has functions of decision making. This is where emotional memories are stored, helps regulate behavior as well, and initiates response to fear. So when trauma activates the amygdala or impacts the amygdala, all of these elements are impacted as well. So talk a lot in PTSD about startle responses and anxiety. That's the amygdala being impacted. Okay, so over here, we've got the hippocampus, which is this little pink sliver next to the amygdala, which is responsible for memory consolidation, navigation, and spatial memory and learning. So when you think about kids that have experienced trauma, like some of those ACEs, learning is impacted. And if you work with kids in counseling, you probably have seen that sometimes they struggle to learn and stay developmentally on pace with their peers. So trauma impacts all of these areas. And so when somebody is exposed to trauma, they can really have big impacts on this brain function. And then if we add the next layer of addiction onto it, or substance use, that's kind of a recipe for lots of struggles. And I'm looking at the chat, Chelsea, yeah. Seems like we need to focus on building healthy families. That's probably what Dr. Folletti would say. He would agree with you for sure. So let's talk about kind of a little bit of the differences between simple versus complex PTSD, or you can even use trauma instead of PTSD. So simple PTSD or simple trauma develops from kind of one incident that's usually experienced as an adult, but it kind of, you can highlight, there's this one thing that happened that was very traumatic, and there's been some fallout or consequences from that issue, from that event. But then on the other side is complex PTSD or complex trauma, which is associated with repeated incidents. So something like domestic violence or ongoing childhood abuse that's happened regularly or consistently over time, creates a broader range of symptoms for an individual. So there's maybe some self-harm going on, some cutting, burning of their skin, things like that. Suicidality could be something clinically you have to deal with. Dissociation, or what some people call losing time, where they just kind of black out or don't remember things. So they just kind of lose a period of time. Problems with relationships, very common. Problems with memory, because the brain is impacted by trauma, and one of the areas we talked about was memory in the hippocampus. And so if that's impacted, then sometimes they struggle to remember things and to remember what happened. They might have challenges or struggles to resolve their sexuality, They may have health-related issues, anger, guilt and shame, of course, a numbness or emotional numbness, loss of faith, whether it's a religious type faith or just faith in humanity or in people, and trust in people and humanity as well. And then just feeling like they're damaged goods, that there's something wrong with them inherently and that they're unlovable, things like that. So if we're looking at complex PTSD, that can be, as you see with this broad range of symptoms, is harder to treat. And then you add the addiction layer onto that, now we're getting very difficult. And simple PTSD is not any easier necessarily to treat, but it can all be linked to one particular incident usually. And so it's a little bit simpler of a pattern to identify than complex PTSD, because often that starts in childhood and is just kind of compounded upon as the person grows older. So those are the two broad categories of trauma that we look at and can have implications for the work that we do with somebody. So the interesting thing is that actually addiction treatment can be re-traumatizing for somebody who has a trauma history. So let's look at some of the ways that might happen that we want to be careful of when we're doing treatment. So as we all know, I think we all know, in the 12-step tradition, there's a concept of powerless in the first step, that we are powerless to our addiction. And with somebody that has a trauma history, the concept of powerlessness is also an element of their potential issues with the trauma that they experienced, that they were, didn't have the power, particularly if they were a child when something happened, that, there's nothing they could do about that situation. And so that can be, when we talk about that in treatment, can be kind of an element of re-traumatization for somebody, because now they're powerless over their addiction. So it's not very, kind of the opposite of that. It's not very empowering for somebody. So they feel like, I'm just a pawn in this whole game and, can't do anything about my situation or about what's going on with me. So that can be really challenging for somebody who has significant trauma and then also a substance use issue. The other piece in kind of a more, I would say, traditional or old school substance use treatment, that there's the concept of the authority of the counselor, so that the counselor knows what the client needs to do and kind of helps facilitate that. For somebody who's experienced trauma as well as addiction, that there, again, it's that idea of not having control and not being able to be autonomous and develop autonomy and self-efficacy. So it's important to kind of work with the client from a more collaborative perspective rather than telling the client what to do or giving advice as a counselor. So it's important to kind of pay attention to that when you're working with somebody who has a trauma history as well as the substance use or addiction issues going on. Confrontation tactics. Again, this might be somewhat dated in terms of addiction treatment, although I still see it in some programs, is a little bit more of a confrontational nature. For example, there's an intervention called the hot seat. It's called several things at different treatment programs, but it's essentially putting one person in the middle of the group and kind of focusing on the rest of the group focuses on what's going on with that particular client and confronting them if necessary, kind of analyzing what they're doing, their behavior, how they're progressing in treatment, things like that. And for somebody who has a trauma history, that can certainly be re-traumatizing for somebody. And even if somebody doesn't have a trauma history, that can be traumatizing for somebody if it's a more aggressive type of confrontation that's going on. So some of those kinds of interventions may not be a good idea for a client with a trauma history. Shaming practices kind of fall along the same line of, of pointing out kind of all the deficiencies of the client can just add to that level of shame that they're already experiencing from the trauma. So some of those kinds of practices related to aggressive confrontation or anything that points out significant deficiencies within the client can be something that's re-traumatizing for them if they have that history of trauma. The focus on character defects, which again comes from the 12-step fellowship, that again kind of reinforces that idea that they're defective, that they already have from the trauma that they've experienced. So sometimes, even though the intention of, or the idea of character defects is not inherently wrong or bad, but what it does is kind of reinforces, just by the name itself of character defect, that something is wrong with this person. And so it can reinforce that shame and that they're, something's wrong with them. They're defective in some way. They're unlovable, things like that. So those may not be, just that terminology alone may not be something that would be a good idea working with people that have experienced trauma and addiction. The idea that addicts can't be trusted to tell the truth. So some of this is just messaging that clients have heard, not necessarily from treatment programs, but just kind of stigma in the community that we don't want to be a part of reinforcing in our treatment programs. So avoiding stereotypes, avoiding stigmatizing language like this also avoids the client being re-traumatized. Discharging a client from a program for non-compliance. So sometimes, because clients with any kind of co-occurring disorder, really, even if they have a addiction and a mental health related issue, that they're going to take a little bit more time, a little bit more effort to progress into recovery and into recovery, not just from the substance use side, but also from the mental health side. And so discharging them for non-compliance, again, can reinforce some of that defective mentality that they already have, that they're failing, they're a failure, they're not good enough. Things like that can really be re-traumatizing for clients. So some treatment programs have started shifting how they deal with non-compliance within treatment programs and what it looks like to be able to continue working with somebody, even if they're struggling within the treatment program, and what can that look like that's a little different for people with trauma and addiction. Punishing clients for being aggressive can sometimes be traumatizing because it activates, when trauma is triggered, it activates that fight or flight and that fear response. And so sometimes that looks like aggression. And of course, we want to keep our clients safe. If we're working in a treatment program, we want to keep people safe from each other if they're being aggressive towards each other, but also considering that someone with a trauma history might be more prone to that because they're just trying to defend themselves and that trauma is being triggered in some way. So looking at a client from that perspective of trauma and what can we do to continue working with this client could be helpful. Not giving clients choices. Again, that speaks to autonomy and self-efficacy, that the more choice we can give our clients, and helping them figure out what the best choices are for them, help them with decision making, help them with problem solving, teaching them how to make healthy decisions can be empowering for them rather than taking away their choices, taking away their options, which can be re-traumatizing, because again, that idea of powerlessness comes up, and that they're being victimized again. Withholding medication-assisted treatment can also be re-traumatizing for clients. Clients with trauma have a variety of issues. And so there may be depression, there may be anxiety, there may be other kind of mood disorders going on. And medication may be necessary in order to help them get over the hump and get into some level of stabilization and recovery. So withholding that can be detrimental to a client. And again, this speaks to choice. So giving them the option that medications are an option. They may not be a long-term option, but they may be a short-term option. So kind of, again, going back to that idea of choice, that can be empowering for a client that has experienced a lot of trauma, that they have a choice in their treatment and in what happens in their treatment. Okay, so trauma-informed treatment, kind of everything that we've been talking about on the last slide, it really requires a paradigm shift away from traditional approaches to addiction treatment, kind of those shaming exercises or really aggressive confrontation exercises, and towards one that seeks to reflect principles of trauma-informed care, which really just means taking into account the trauma and the effects of trauma, as well as the addiction and the effects of the addiction. And understanding that trauma impacts the brain. And so some of this, these behaviors and these struggles that we see clients going through in treatment is because their brain has been impacted. And so brains need to heal and need to be given time to heal and the resources to heal. So sometimes that includes medication. Sometimes it includes just time and energy spent in processing and dealing with some of the trauma as well as the addiction. And so paying attention to all of that might be going on with a client and developing a treatment plan that is inclusive of the trauma elements, what they've experienced, medication if they need it, alternative therapeutic options that might be helpful to them in kind of dealing with both areas at the same time. So both the trauma and the addiction at the same time in an integrated manner, which is really a big departure from what we consider to be traditional approaches to addiction treatment, which is very abstinence-based, 12-step based. And not that any of that is bad or wrong, it's just not necessarily helpful for clients that have a significant trauma history as well, that they need a little bit more integrated treatment, and that's not often found in some traditional approaches. Okay, so thinking about kind of the old school idea of punishment or consequences in treatment for non-compliance, we want to create more of a safe space if we want to be inclusive of trauma in our addiction treatment programs. So how can we create safety? Those are things to think about. Depending on the type of program that you're working in, that's going to look very different for each of you. Or if you're working in a school or a community agency, or working in, within the criminal justice system, working in a residential program versus an outpatient program. We want to really think about how can we create a safe space for people that have experienced trauma and experienced addiction, and what does that look like to move away from punishing them for, behavior, to creating a safe space for them to be able to process and us to help them process and work towards recovery, whatever that looks like. So, and, kind of all these on the left are going to be what we want to avoid, and everything on the right is going to be what we're trying to work towards. So clients that come in with trauma and addiction tend to be distrustful because they've had lots of experiences where people have abused them or treated them poorly. And so how do we create trust? Again, that's going to look very different depending on the environment you work in, but that's something to consider. Is from a trauma-informed perspective, we want to create an environment where trust can be built rather than kind of torn down or continued in that pattern of distrust. Avoiding the aggressive confrontation and working more towards collaboration and giving clients choices and empowering them to be an engaged part of their treatment program. Moving away from the authoritative approach, and this is the counselor being the authority, to choice and treatment empowerment. So again, providing them choices, talking to them about pros and cons of these various choices. What do they think would be the best for them? What do you think would be the best for them? And working from a collaborative perspective to look at those choices and help them make choices that are going to be best for them as the client. And the last one here, moving away from compliance, the idea of compliance with a one-size-fits-all treatment program, to transformation. So what does this person individually need to help them transform their lives and be healthier, hopefully? Again, taking into account the trauma history and that some of their trauma experiences may have impacted their brain to the point where it's difficult to comply with some treatment program, rules or guidelines. So finding them the best treatment program or the best kind of cocktail of treatment services to help them move towards transformation is what's needed. So kind of that individualized treatment approach. That one size fits all doesn't work for everyone. And in particular is people with a trauma history combined with addiction, they really struggle in very structured programs because they, kind of can't or struggle to follow. It's not that they can't, but they struggle to follow all the rules and guidelines in the more structured treatment programs. So thinking about that, if the environment you work in has a lot of people that have both trauma and addiction, we might have to look at our treatment programs a little different and figure out how can we move towards some of these things on the right and away from some of these things on the left that might historically have been a part of treatment programs. Let's see, I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, and Kent, you're absolutely right. First, do no harm. When we're looking at somebody with a trauma history and addiction, that some of the things that we might do with somebody that just has an addiction without the trauma are going to look different than what we need to do with somebody that has trauma and addiction, because we could be doing harm. Like if we engage in some of this aggressive confrontation or discharging from programs for non-compliance, that might do harm to the client rather than be helpful to them. So certainly that kind of ethical principle is important to consider when looking at working with these types of clients with both issues. So something that is, kind of gotten more attention, I would say, lately is that, but it's not a new concept, but that trauma is stored in the body. So our body remembers, even if kind of our brain doesn't remember necessarily the details of a trauma we might have experienced. And that survivors, the second bullet point here, survivors develop cover stories to explain their symptoms and behavior that don't necessarily speak to the trauma that they experienced. It's sort of a defense mechanism. So if they, for example, have a startle response, they might say, oh, that's my anxiety. My nerves are bad, something like that. And so they're not necessarily talking about the trauma that they experienced that is being triggered and And so they're having what appears to be an anxious response, and they just kind of chalk it up to the anxiety, when that's maybe not really what's going on. And that the experience of trauma shows up in our instinctual responses, such as fight, flight, freeze, submit, or attach. And so depending on what their trauma experience was and, kind of how they processed that or experienced it, whether it was chronic or one single incident, that part of the brain that's responsible for our fear responses. And when we're in that moment, kind of what's triggered is either flight, fight, freeze, submit, or attach. Any of those things could show up, and that could really be a trauma response rather than just, oh, that's just my anxiety, or, oh, you scared me, something like that. And all of this picture, I love this little drawing on the right, kind of shows all the different things that could show up in the body. So some are noticeable and some are more hidden. And helping clients, sometimes I show this to clients and give them the opportunity to look at all of these and say, hey, I experience sweating, or muscles get tense for action, I hyperventilate or have shallow breathing. And then all these hidden ones are really helpful to look at, because I can't see those. They're not visual to me. So sometimes when I'm working with a client, I can notice when their pupils dilate, for example, or when they appear to be more tense, when their breathing changes. I can kind of notice that. But what I can't notice is the hidden effects. And so it's helpful for a client to be able to identify those. And I need my client to tell me what those are. So I use this graphic with clients quite a bit to help them identify what might be going on with them. And then, we can figure out, what do we need to do with that? How problematic are those things? So what this means is that we may need to do some work with the body. And we may need to do things like teach them breathing practices to help manage their breathing when they start hyperventilating. We may need to do things that are more movement oriented to help them deal with any tensing muscles or tension that might be in the body. So I hope what's coming to mind for you is mindfulness-based interventions, that we teach them some mindfulness skills to help them de-escalate when they're triggered, and then also do some reality testing so that they can stay kind of in the present and not activate fully the trauma. And also can help with like impulsivity issues related to addiction, and also that flight, fight, freeze phenomenon that happens that can help manage those impulsivities too. So what are some body-based interventions that we could use? Not that you necessarily have to learn all of these things, but you might refer clients to some of these services if you don't do them at your treatment program or you don't do them in your practice. You could always look for other practitioners that do some of these things and share it with them. So we'll start with kind of the movement of yoga. There's some counselors integrate yoga into their practice, into their work. Some treatment programs have yoga classes for movement, for teaching mindfulness, things like that. Art, incorporating some creativity into your sessions, into your work with clients, can be helpful. And it helps. I've seen some really interesting and cool trauma-specific programs that incorporate a lot of art, whether it's through collages, painting, different art mediums. But that can really help clients process both the trauma and work on their addiction related elements as well. Music can help people de-escalate. Sounds in general can, kind of listening to an app that has the waves, so it sounds like you're at the beach, can be calming, versus listening to heavy metal music, for example, which may be triggering or kind of amp somebody up more. So sometimes I've worked with clients to develop a playlist on their phone or on their, back in the day when we had, CDs that you could burn or cassette tapes that you could make a mixtape. But whatever medium they want to use, you can create a playlist of music that's kind of calming or de-escalating for a client to help them when they're triggered, that they can just put that music on and it can help them calm down. Movement therapies or equine therapies, you might need to find a practitioner or clinician that really specializes in those areas. Obviously for equine, you need access to horses, so that may not be accessible for everyone. But there are particular programs and people who specialize in movement and in equine therapy that can help clients start to resolve some of the trauma and kind of work with their senses to build trust. Like in the case of equine therapy, helps clients learn to build trust with the horse and just caring for another, an animal, things like that can be really beneficial. Drumming, I've seen some cool stuff with drum circles and just kind of that rhythmic learning to drum and beat on a drum can work out some aggression, can also help people physically do something and respond to the beats of the drums and do some really interesting work that way. Same thing with sound healing. Again, these things are typically done by people that specialize in these areas. So if your treatment program offers that, wonderful. If not, you may, want to have some referrals in mind for clients that you think would benefit from drumming or sound healing kinds of activities. Mindfulness. I feel like we talk about mindfulness a lot these days, but it's so applicable for people struggling with any kind of trauma history, any kind of addiction related issue. Just teaching people deep breathing can be so helpful. Different kinds of breathing practices can be really helpful in de-escalating and managing that hyperventilation and that startle response. Meditation, again, slowing down, staying in the present, staying in the here and now, teaching clients how to calm their bodies. So breathing and meditation and visualization, all these mindfulness practices really have a dual purpose, because not only do they help a client center their mind, but also center their bodies, because what happens when we take deep breaths is we are getting oxygen to our muscles. And so if there's tension in our body, it's helping push oxygen through those muscles that are tense so that they relax. And through the deep breathing, our muscles naturally relax and we naturally deal with whatever tension might be in our bodies. So other specialized treatment programs, specialized treatment services would include EMDR, brain spotting. These are things you need special training in to be able to do. But again, it works with the trauma elements. And so it's specifically focused on helping someone deal with their trauma and process through their trauma in a little bit of a different way. I've had some clients that have been really benefited from working in theater companies or taking improv classes, just learning how to move their bodies in a different way, taking risks in terms of playing characters on stage And that's been kind of cathartic and, help them process things in a little bit of a different way. Psychodrama, same kind of idea, where you're moving your body in a different way. You're creating scenes, working out some of the trauma experiences, perhaps through this kind of theater, improv, psychodrama perspective, can do some really interesting things. Sensory motor techniques, which again is playing on your 5 senses and connecting your senses and kind of helping you go through, deal with the trauma, but also is applicable to addiction. SMART, sensory motor psychotherapy, somatic re-experiencing, which deals with what's going on in the body and what's being triggered physically. So those psychosomatic responses, what's being triggered by the trauma. And as well, if a client is having a craving, for example. So if I'm having a craving, experiencing a craving, that might also mean that my trauma is being triggered. So the reason that I want to go use is because my trauma is being triggered, and how do I work through that in a little bit of a different way? Neurofeedback can be helpful. Again, that's brain function. And since we know that trauma and addiction impact the brain, referring somebody for neurofeedback can be an alternative therapy that can have good impacts. Energy work, Reiki, tapping, AIT or advanced integrative therapy, all energy work related, that can be a different experience for a client to work through their trauma that's experienced in the body. We just talked about trauma being held in the body and that the body remembers. Doing some energy work could be helpful for a client. Acupuncture, massage therapy, again, dealing with pressure points, energy of the body. All of these things can be really beneficial for clients that trauma, that they're having kind of a somatic response to trauma. So not every client is going to find all of these helpful or even be interested in all of these kinds of techniques. They're kind of what most consider alternative treatment options, or kind of not your mainstream treatment options in a lot of ways. So, but there are options that I think we don't always think about when we're working with clients, and that can be really helpful for clients that are experiencing both trauma and addiction, or substance use issues at the same time, because it's helping deal with the same kinds of issues. So when the trauma is held in the body and it's triggering somebody to want to use a substance, then doing some of these kinds of alternative therapies, might just help somebody unlock their recovery and be able to move into recovery in a little bit of a different way. And they're not traditional approaches, but have been shown, not just in research, but also anecdotal from my clients that I've worked with over the years, that some of these alternative therapies they're just different enough that it creates kind of a breakthrough for somebody that they may not have had through more traditional talk therapy, whether it's individuals or group sessions, or going to 12-step meetings or other self-help related activities. They may just need something a little bit different to help them move forward. So those are just some options. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a few. So whatever kind of piques your interest, I encourage you to do more research on, to find practitioners and clinicians in your area that do some of these things that you can work with or provide referrals to, get a little more information.